This is the Quran. Islamic followers refer to this as the last of the three testaments. It is considered Islam's holiest book. We the people have been told by 3 successive U.S. presidents that Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion. We are told by the media that this book is a peaceful book. In light of all that, it seems fair to examine those claims. Let's consider how peaceful and tolerant Islam is and has been for the past, well, since the 7th century, since its founding. Last month, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia declared it necessary for all Muslims to destroy all the churches in Kuwait and wherever else they may be in Islamic lands. Now, as bad as that may seem, it is worse. If you go to the Quran, you will find this. This is from Surah, chapter 9, verse 5, Surah 9:5. It reads, and these are Muhammad's words, or the words of the angel, the spirit that gave them to Muhammad. Slay the unbelievers wherever they are found. The unbelievers is anyone who doesn't believe in Islam. Take those you wish as captives, besiege the unbelievers, prepare them for ambush. But if they repent and establish worship and pay their jizya, then let them go their way. Now, what does it say? That says convert or else. Those are commands. Those are commands. They're not suggestions. They are commands for all Muslims and all Muslim communities. It is a matter of undisputed history that in the year 1066, 4,000 Jews were slaughtered by Muslims in Granada. In one day, in 1399, 100,000 Hindus were slaughtered in one day by Muslims. Some 1 million Christian Armenians were killed in the early 1900s. Overall, since its beginning, Islam has been responsible. Their disciples have killed over 240 million people. 240 million. That is more than 2/3 the United States population. On March 22nd, Dr. Matthew Levitt told the Congressional Committee of Homeland Security that Muslim leaders in Iran have now approved attacks against the United States. Iran already furnishes the weaponry and the plans for surrogates to continue their assault on the Jewish homeland. On the same day, Peter King, co-chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Congressional Committee, reported that findings now indicate that the number of Hezbollah operatives already operating here in the United States number in the hundreds. Many of those arrived from across the U.S.-Mexican border. I was asked yesterday whether it was possible that some Muslims who favor keeping our borders open do so because it leaves the borders open for more radicals, an easier path into the U.S. I don't know the answer to that, but it is an intriguing question. Iran is not the only Islamic state, not the only Islamic terrorist state. Radical Muslims are gaining a foothold in Middle Eastern nations. First, Jews were expelled from Arabian lands, and now Christians are being expelled from lands that their ancestors have lived for generations. USA Today reported that the democracy movement, or as we know it better, the Arab Spring, is now being used against Christians. On March 8th, World Net Daily reported that jihadists announced plans to eradicate all Jews and Christians throughout northern Nigeria. Last year, Iranian authorities began rounding up Christians across the nation. Those arrests are not just church leaders. They're not just house church leaders. They're also rounding up all the members. House churches have been swept clean in 5 Iranian cities already. Swept clean. Just this year, militants in Syria began forcing Christians to flee their home. 60% of those were Roman Catholic. The Muslim population is growing rapidly elsewhere. In Europe, its influence has had many negative influences, negative social and political influences throughout Europe and European culture. You couple that with a decline of traditional Jewish and Christian values on that continent, and what we get is a decline in the time-honored moral structure and the economic structure. The economic structure is falling at an astonishing pace. A poll in the United Kingdom, released just a month ago, found that 74% of the citizens in Scotland, in France, and in the UK, United Kingdom, said that Christians receive more negative discrimination than any other group. Christian church attendance has been declining throughout Europe for a long time. Islam, by comparison, is thriving. There are mosques going up all the time. What is ongoing in Europe is also ongoing worldwide. From 2003 to 2012, terrorist attacks on Christians have increased by 300%. That's 300% in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia. We're going to talk about Muhammad. To understand any religion, it is absolutely important for any researcher first to understand the founder of that religion. If we wanted to understand, for example, and we didn't know anything about Judaism, the first person we should look to and find out all we could about would be Moses. If we wanted to understand spiritualism, we'd look to Kate Fox in the 1800s. Or if we wanted to understand Buddhism, we'd look for Siddhartha Gautama. But in Islam, Muhammad is the founder of that religion. It will explain a lot about his religion, and it will explain a lot about the religion's practices. We can begin our inquiry with this book. I don't know if everyone has read it, but it is a great book to understand who Muhammad really was and what his background was. That's a good beginning. His words, as reported in there, are the words given to him directly, supposedly, from Allah, from God. We find throughout the Quran that Muhammad instructs his followers to either kill any unbelievers or those who have abandoned that religion, or tax non-Muslims with that jizya, tribute tax. Those who abandon the religion do not have the option of paying a tax. There is only one option for those people. If you are a Muslim, you abandon the Muslim religion, the Islamic religion, you are to be killed. That is in the Quran, that is in the Hadiths. There are no other options. The Quran explains it this way. In Surah 9:29, fight those who do not believe in Allah or believe in the last day, even if they are people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Muhammad was born in Mecca. Full name of that city was Makkah el-Mukarramah, translated literally to mean Mecca the Honored. During the Prophet's younger years, the city was made up of Jews, of Christians, and polytheists, and a few others. Polytheists were the dominant religion. A polytheist is one who believes in many gods. In Mecca, the polytheists believed in up to 360 gods. Today, Mecca is 100% Muslim. If you are not Muslim, you are not allowed to enter that city. Muhammad, at an early age, all the way from childhood, from his uncle, learned how to administer and lead caravans. That was a complex job in those days. As an adult, he ultimately accepted a job with a wealthy merchant woman, leading caravans for her. She was 16 years older than him, but he ultimately married her. And after that, he did not have to work so hard. He still worked, but not quite so difficult. That's still done today. I mean, people marry rich people, and didn't John Kerry get rich that way? Between these caravan drives, he would retreat to a remote cave outside the city, and there he would meditate. One day, he said, a spirit made the first of many visits to come while he was in that cave. That spirit is also commonly referred to, as I mentioned, as the revealer. Muhammad claimed this revealer continued visiting for the next 23 years of his life. The revealer is now widely taught to be the great archangel Gabriel. But I need to point out that neither the word angel nor is the name of a spirit. That is not in the Quran. But yet Muslims are widely taught that it was Gabriel for several reasons. Jibril, as his name is stated in Arabic, part of that assumption had to do with a statement in Surah 2:97-98, where Gabriel's name is mentioned not as a spirit, but it's mentioned right along with the warrior archangel Michael. And of course, Gabriel was then, as is now, considered the messenger of God. So it made sense to him. The Spirit told Muhammad that Allah had given the Jews and Jesus the right message. In other words, he said the scriptures were actually written properly. But he said that the Jews were orally giving, they were saying the wrong message. Well, most people that day could not read. And this illiteracy kept them from understanding that what he was saying about this new religion that he had was altogether different about what was in the scriptures. So when it came to who was telling the truth about the scriptures, it was sort of a he said argument between Muhammad and the Jewish camp. The prophet claimed that the revealer told him, Muhammad, that he was to be Allah's last prophet. His job was to correct what was then taught orally from the Torah and the rest of the Testaments. But in truth, there is nothing of any importance in the scriptures that compares whatsoever to what is written in the Quran. Nothing. At first, when Muhammad attempted to convert his neighbors to this then new religion, they weren't really enthusiastic about it. In fact, well, he did use it. I might point out, though, he did use some peaceful messages. He would say, for example, you don't have to believe in this religion. We won't. I don't demand you believe in this religion. Those are the peaceful sayings in the Quran. I'll give you a couple a little later. Most Meccans, though, did not accept the teachings, particularly polytheists. Well, really, none of them did. Only a few could accept that he even had met or had talked to the messenger of God. In time, over the years, he really wasn't very successful in getting people to join, and he started becoming very angry about his lack of success. Even his own uncle, who had raised him from childhood because his parents had passed away, he could not believe that he had met a messenger of Allah either. So eventually the prophet threw a fit and even cursed his uncle and his aunt, and that curse is recorded today in the Quran. Over the next few years, the prophet's wife and the uncle passed away. After that, because his uncle was a man of esteem, he was a respected figure, his wife was wealthy and she was respected, but after that he had no public standing once they were gone. To some, he had become more than just a nuisance. He had become a danger. Few Jews actually plotted to kill him. And he and his band of about roughly 100 or so got wind of this, and they decided to flee the city, to flee Mecca. They went to the town of Medina, which would be about 180 miles north of Mecca. That pilgrimage that he took, this escape, is considered divine to Muslims today. It is known as the Hijra. The Hijra is considered so divine that the modern Islamic calendar actually begins on the day of that journey to Medina. The Hijra, by the way, means literally to escape or to flee. That's the Arabic word for escape. Once in Medina, though, now although he knew a great deal about caravans, but that wouldn't work in Medina, because in today's dollars, you're probably talking about something close to $1 million to organize a successful caravan of transporting merchandise. So to solve this financial problem, Muhammad decided instead to raid the caravans that were already running along the path. All these caravans run across the road that's popularly known as the Silk Road. In fact, A friend of mine in here was a pilot, and he used to fly over the Silk Road at one time. This was a commercial pathway from which it connected Europe, North and East Africa, Asia. It was very important. Marco Polo, in fact, even once traveled that road on his route toward China. Muhammad's accounting method for this new enterprise was rather simple. He said that Allah told him he was to keep 20% of all the loot that was stolen, and the other 80% would be divided among all his band. Now, obviously, these men became quite well-to-do over this, but Muhammad became the wealthiest of all. Caravans along the Silk Road were not small affairs. I think that perhaps many people get that idea from modern films. For example, a small caravan would be 50 to 100 camels, and they would carry armed guards to protect them. And that was a size that Muhammad actually started raiding at first. But a large caravan would be between 2,000 and 3,000 camels, and they would carry several hundred armed guards to protect their merchandise. The merchandise that they had would be China. From China came silk, which is what gave it the name Silk Road, porcelain, dates, spices, gold, silver, valuable commodities in general is what was transported along there. Muhammad protected the craft of caravan raiding. They carried, his army grew, by the way, because of all this wealth that was flowing into the people. But he and his men were not ordinary thieves. Law enforcement people will tell you that an ordinary thief, a breaking and entering man, a robber on the street, all they're interested in is getting as much loot as possible. They're not interested in killing the people. They're not interested in taking a chance and hurting themselves. They just want the booty. Well, that isn't what Muhammad's men did. That band, under Muhammad's direction, killed every man, the ones that weren't killed in the battle were killed thereafter, and every boy above the age of puberty. The young boys and the women were taken as either personal slaves and or slaves to be sold in the slave trade. I said needlessly killed. That isn't exactly right. I should have said wiping out those men was required by Allah. The Quran commands in Surah 8:7, wipe the infidels out to the last. Wipe the infidels out to the last. Apparently, in addition to that, the people of Medina were not so hidebound in their religions as they were back in Mecca. And that's part of the reason that his religion was able to grow a little bit. But the primary reason for his big growth and the primary reason for the growth of his vast army was because of the money from the raiding of the caravans. The prophet's power at that time cannot be overestimated. He was the wealthiest man in all of Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula alone is about 1/3 the size of the United States of America. But certainly, he was the leader of a religion also, which is a huge amount of power, and he was the leader of a great army. He returned to Mecca with his armed force, the city in which he had been turned out, and took over that city as well. And today, as I said, that is all Muslim, and it was his hometown. There is no religion in human history that has grown so far and so fast as Islam. Islam took over all of Arabia. According to the rankings of the major religions of the world, Islam now has somewhere around 1.5 billion, between 1.5 billion and 1.6 billion adherents. Christianity remains somewhat larger. Christianity has just over 2 billion members. The Quran itself is comprised of nothing more than the revelations claimed to be from Allah's spiritual messenger. Muhammad, though, and this always surprises people, Muhammad did not write this book. Muhammad is widely believed to have been illiterate. The reason researchers believe he was illiterate is few people of his day could read anyway. And secondly, had he been able to read, he should have been able to read the scriptures and know that everything he was proclaiming that would later go into the Quran is completely contrary to what is written within the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's nothing of any importance that is there. His followers wrote the book only after Muhammad died. They claimed they could remember every word as he said it exactly. And that's, now there's one thing about the Quran though. This is not written in any order. There's no beginning, middle, and end. It's just a bunch of sayings put together. And sometimes there'll be old sayings right next to new sayings. Today, Islamic tradition portrays Muhammad as the perfect man and teaches that every Muslim should be like him. Muslims consider him to be the primary model for human behavior. It's often said, most notably by our last three presidents and the former Prime Minister of Britain, that Islam is a peaceful religion. Prime Minister Brown and President Clinton each stated flatly that radical Muslims were not following the messages within the Quran. Their claims are bolstered by an elite academic group, the mass media. There are writers and broadcasters who say things that are, they say it with conviction and as if they have presumed authority to say it. But the truth is that very few have ever read the Quran. Very few. Those you heard tonight, I can guarantee you, on MSNBC, have never read the Quran. The burning question, therefore, is, does Islam actually sanction the violence that is prevalent around the world? I'll let you answer that after you hear a few things here. The Quran, the Hadiths, Islamic tradition, Islamic history, and Islamic law all have been witness, or all bear witness, I should say, to the necessity for violence by Muslims. We have 14 centuries of recorded history available to us to reach a logical conclusion as to whether Islam is peaceful and tolerant. Those claims are entirely at odds with a history. Islamic violence is not just some choice by a few. Violence is mandated in the Quran, the Hadiths, and a seemingly endless procession of imams that continue to this day. Certainly, there are many peaceful verses in the Quran. Those earliest verses made in Mecca when Muhammad was attempting to convert Jews, was attempting to convert Christians and others to his then new religion. But after he fled Mecca, those sayings were anything but peaceful. They were in direct conflict. The later sayings, direct conflict with the peaceful sayings that came before. Now, here's an example. This is in Surah 29:46. This was stated in the Meccan days of Muhammad. The Spirit told him, "Do not argue with the people of the book unless they attempt to inflict injury. Instead, tell them, we believe in the revelation which has come down to us and which has come down to you. Our Allah and yours are the same." Now fine, that's peaceful. But later, in the Medina days, the message changes. This is from Surah 9:29. "Fight those who do not believe in Allah. Fight those who do not believe in the last day. Fight those who do not acknowledge the religion of Islam." This includes the people of the book, and they, until they pay a tax with willing submission and thereafter feel subdued. Of course, they also have to become Muslim. And Surah 5:33, "Any who do not accept Islam should be murdered or crucified, or their hands and their feet cut off on opposite sides." Now, that actually happened. Al-Jarud was an early Iraqi collector of prophetic hadith. In one of the narratives reported in his book, the book was called El-Maraqah, fascinating, a group of 8 men from the Jewish tribe of Ukil came to the prophet and asked for some milk. They later became Muslims, but they abandoned their religion. You remember, there is no choice for someone who abandons the religion. The prophet Muhammad had the men brought before him. He had their hands and feet cut off, just as in that surah. He ordered nails to be heated and passed over their eyes. They were left blind in the rocky area of Medina. When they asked for water, no one would comply, and they died of thirst there in the city of Medina. In the authoritative historical work, The Life of Mohammed, and that is an excellent book of history, it is recorded on page 464 that when a defeated Jewish tribe surrendered to the apostle, Muhammad had trenches dug at the market in Medina. He sent for their surviving men in batches. He had their heads struck off in the trenches. The author gave the number of men as between 600 and 700, but historical records by witness had placed the number as high as 900. I'm not going to quibble over a couple of hundred here. It was a lot of people. Muhammad and his 12-year-old wife, sat on the side and watched as these men's heads were these men are being beheaded. The women, by the way, were not beheaded. They were either taken as personal slaves or sold into the slave trade, as was the custom. The Prophet Muhammad participated in many of those battles and raids. He ordered the assassination of political opponents, and in general, he behaved like any 7th century warlord. The problem is, when this is transferred into the 21st century, what you get is terrorism. A multitude of Islamic scholars agree that because the violent passages were stated later than the earliest passages, the most recent overrule any passages that were peaceful. The most violent overrule them. The Quran has 114 surahs. 71 of those contain verses that have been overruled through replacement in more recent verses. Now, I haven't counted the numbers, but Islamic scholars report that 65% of all peaceful verses have been replaced by violent verses. This replacement of all the peaceful verses means, by the way, that's called abrogation. You remember what abrogation is? It's replacement of laws, okay. But in Islam, this abrogation means that there are no peaceful verses in the Quran because they have all been overruled. There aren't any. It is not a peaceful book. To be clear, the peaceful verses are Meccan. When Muhammad was in Mecca and attempting to gain followers, in the early days, the violent passages were declared after he fled from the Jews who planned to murder him in Medina in the year 622. The peaceful verses are overruled or abrogated by Muhammad's later sayings. The Quran holds a unique place in history. There is no other book that claims to be dictated by God word for word in its entirety. The Quran stands alone in that sense. And every word is claimed to be remembered by God himself. Because those are the words of God, the Quran is to remain the same for all times. The words cannot be changed, and the words cannot be questioned. Now, of course, Michael said earlier, most Muslims are peaceful. But to accept only the peaceful part places those Muslims outside Orthodox Islam. They're outside the religion's history, they're outside the religion's traditions. In fact, peaceful Muslims are at great risk from Islamic governments, by strict Islamic governments. They ignore the perfect copy of the perfect book. Today, those people are known as moderates. The Islam calls them hypocrites. The Quran calls them hypocrites. They are named hypocrites because Muhammad said, in their heart is a disease. The book commands that all hypocrites, moderates, are to be killed. A broadcast reporter recently said, unbelievable statement, that the only time anyone has attacked the United States on its soil was 9/11. Well, that isn't true. Apparently, this reporter either forgot or did not remember the 1993 attacks against the World Trade Center, and this reporter did not know, or this reporter forgot that in the War of 1812, the city of Washington, D.C. was burned and captured. But the important thing to remember here today is the 2001 attack and the 1993 attack was not the United States' first brush with Muslims. The United States had been at war with Muslim raiders almost from its beginning. Before and during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, Muslim pirates along the Barbary coast were sea pirates, just as Muhammad's band were sand pirates. They attacked and looted United States and European merchant ships. Those raiders are best known in history as the Barbary Pirates. Jefferson had spoken before he became president with European leaders, and the leaders told him that there is no way you can trust these people. If you plan on negotiating with them, their signatures are not to be trusted, and their words are not to be trusted. They lie. They lie. They lie because they're dealing with non-Muslims. Just as Muhammad's band had done when he was raiding the caravans, the pirates killed all the men and all the boys above puberty, killed them all. They took the women and they took the children, either as personal slaves or to be sold in the slave trade. And this is written in the Quran, Surah 47, verse 4. Commanded Muslims, when you meet the unbelievers in the battlefield, strike off their heads. And when you have laid the survivors low, bind the survivors firmly. The Barbary pirates took the women and children to be sold into slavery. Young boys, unfortunately, were castrated. That's because eunuchs brought more money in the slave trade than did boys who were not castrated. Unfortunately for those boys, most of them, because of that primitive surgery, did not survive. So in an attempt to understand this strange enemy, President Jefferson bought and studied a book of the Quran. He learned from such passages as Surah 858 that Muslims are given permission to lie to non-Muslims and to break treaties with non-believers simply because they are non-believers. A long list of Quranic verses like Surah 923 and 9:173, which command Muslims to continue fighting for Allah no matter what, did not give President Jefferson a lot of hope for coming to a reasonable agreement. So he followed the European leaders' earlier advice. Having studied the Quran, Thomas Jefferson ultimately decided the only way to stop the piracy was to defeat them in battle. Students of naval history, and we have a graduate tonight from the U.S. Naval Academy, students of naval history know that that is why the United States Navy was then created. The Navy and the Marines defeated the pirates on the sea and on the land at Tripoli, a city that is now part of Libya. The Muslim pirates' defeat is still honored in the United States Marine hymn, which reads, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we will fight our nation's battle on the land as on the sea." The Barbary pirates were following the principle of jihad, the example set by Muhammad's raiders. Many today claim the word jihad simply means, and I've had this told to me by Muslims, simply means submission or surrender or enter struggle. That is not wrong, but the Quran is very clear about its meaning. Surah 2:190 tells us, and I quote, "Jihad is holy fighting in Allah's cause, with full force of numbers and weaponry. It is given the utmost importance in Islam. Jihad is one of its pillars. It's one of the 5 pillars. By war, Islam is established. Jihad, war, is an obligatory duty in Islam on every Muslim." Have you ever heard that before? Jihad is not just submission. Jihad is war with full force and numbers, as stated in the Quran by Muhammad, given to him by the Spirit from Allah. Today, we apparently have forgotten that lesson learned by President Jefferson. Our mass news outlets report almost daily that many leaders still believe they can negotiate with Islamists. Whether we believe we are at war with Islam or not The Orthodox Islamists certainly believe themselves to be at war with all non-Muslims. That war will be never-ending until the end of earthly existence. The Quran, Surah 2191, commands, "If they are at war with you, murder them wherever you find them." True Islamic believers have neither reason nor desire to negotiate with infidels. Those sorts of commands are duties given to all Muslims and all Muslim communities. Thomas Jefferson's edition of the Quran that he studied to understand the enemy and defeat the enemy is still preserved in our national archives. On the day that the first Muslim congressman, Congressional Representative Keith Ellison, was sworn into office, being a Muslim, he did not take the oath on the Bible. He took the oath on the Quran. Ironically, that Quran was the exact same book that Thomas Jefferson had studied to defeat Muslims at the Barbary Coast. The same book. Now, I watched this on television, and it was really interesting because that bit of information was never reported by reporters on NBC, CBS, ABC, MSNBC, BSNBC, none of them. If those reporters knew the truth about that book's history, they were either intimidated by political correctness or by fear of reprisal. Instead, they twisted the truth. The statement given, it didn't matter what channel you flipped to. President Jefferson was touted as an example of a tolerant man who studied both the Quran and the Bible.
Oh boy.
That is political correctness. It is everywhere. Last Halloween in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, a man dressed up as Zombie Mohammad. Now, that may seem a controversial act to some, a controversial deed, but under the U.S. Constitution, that is protected as freedom of expression. Unfortunately, though, for this man, a Muslim happened to be in the Halloween crowd. He beat the crap out of this man. And so it went to court. Now, the prosecutor felt he had an open and shut case. This was assault and battery, no defense whatsoever, plenty of witnesses. That is not what happened. Instead, the judge criticized Zombie Man for being insensitive. He extended his sympathy to the Muslim who was not injured whatsoever, and the Muslim was let go without penalty.
The judge was a Muslim.
I don't know.
He was.
Oh, was he a Muslim? Is it true?
The judge was a Muslim.
Well, that explains it then. I did not know that. I missed that part in the news.
They won't tell you.
That should not be surprising to me there, however. How many still believe, how many here, just I'll try to quick show, how many believe that many judges don't really care what the Constitution says?
Yeah.
Okay. Or for that matter, how many legislators don't really care that much about the Constitution? Yeah. Our elected leaders. It's coming close to home. A representative with the Islamic group CARE had been invited over to Steinbrenner High School here in Tampa, Florida, just south of us. CARE, Arab Islamic relations, was indoctrinating children with Islamic propaganda and Sharia law. The Florida Family Association, which is a pro-family group, complained. The Tampa Tribune complained about the Florida Family Association and took the side of CARE. Now, I understand. I mean, newspapers in a heavily Muslim area get advertising from Muslims, and they get subscriptions from Muslims. The CARE has its state home office in Tampa. The reason they established themselves in Tampa is Tampa has an extremely large Muslim population throughout the whole Tampa Bay area. I'm not sure that everyone knows that, but I spent a lot of time in Tampa. It is heavy. According to the Florida Family Association, they are very near, right now, the same percentage of Arabic Muslims as Dearborn, Michigan. And Dearborn, Michigan is 50% Arabic Muslim, 50%. Okay, we're getting there. Political correctness and fear of reprisal are given the lion's share of blame for leaders who will not speak out against dangers of Islam. After all, controversy does spark tension. But there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Socrates set an example. He felt it necessary to create tension among people so that individuals could rise above the bondage of myths and half-truths. That effort allowed us today. That was one of the many things that allowed us today to have creative effort and objective appraisal. That sort of determination is necessary for society to grow. It allows us to rise above ignorance and into a realm of brotherhood and understanding. And an on-campus give and take at Central Florida, University of Central Florida, about 2 years ago, there were 4 representatives of the Muslim Student Union there, and me. And I was told by those representatives that those passages in the Quran which encourage fighting are only intended to be whenever Muslims are attacked. Well, okay. Then why does the Quran read this way in Surah 865? O Prophet, urge the believers to war. Urge the believers to war. Start the fight. And in Surah 9:14, fight them. Allah will punish them by your hands. And Surah 47:4, when you meet unbelievers in holy jihad, chop off their heads. Anyone who keeps up with current events realizes that radical Islamists are now overtaking more Middle Eastern countries, but it's happening elsewhere as well. In the past few weeks, Islamists in the northern half of Mali have plunged that nation into crisis. Mali is in Western Africa, and it is an area larger than France, bigger than France. On one side is a secular group, and the other side is an Islamic sect that wants to establish Sharia law. Apparently, it's working. They call it a moderate north. Already, women in the 3 cities have been forbidden to go without veils. Sharia law is Islamic law, but it is absolutely necessary to realize there are 2 kinds of laws. There are just laws and there are unjust laws. Beheading a woman for improper dress, or requiring a young woman to marry a man to whom she does not want to marry, usually because one suitor has more dowry to give to the family than the other, that is not a just law. Most of us, I believe, obey laws that are just. That is not just a legal obligation, it's a moral obligation. But Martin Luther King made a statement. By contrast to just laws, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. St. Augustine wrote, an unjust law, love this, is no law at all. An unjust law is no law at all. Laws that are based on killing, maiming, torturing another because that person happens to disagree or does not believe in one's religion, those laws are unjust. The laws and practices of Islam do not particularly respect women or the value of a woman. The Quran states in Surah 223, get this is why they think about women. This is the Quran. Your wives are no more than a field to be plowed. So approach your field whenever and however you will. The Hadith records that Muhammad struck his own underage wife, Alicia, in the chest while she was lying in bed. The reason he did so is because she went out of the house without his permission. And that was his favorite wife. He married Aisha, when she was just 6 years old. Now, I said it one time to a group, in fact, it was to those Muslim Student Associations. I said, that's pedophilia, isn't it? And they said, well, no, he didn't have relations until she was 9. And by the way, not one of those representatives had read the entire Quran. But the prophet also had many other wives. He had 13 concubines, and he had a bunch of female slaves as well. Many admonitions in Islam stress women's responsibility to submit in public to the way they look at other people, to the way they gaze out at women, the way they talk to a man. But it also makes another statement here. Hadith 326, the way they dress, of course, is very important. Hadith 326 says that words of a woman are worth only one half as much as those of a man. The words of a woman are worth only one half as much as a man. And that hadith goes on to say that women are deficient in mind. Most of them are smarter than me, I know that. The hadith goes on to declare that wives are playthings. Wives are playthings, so take your pick. Now, who do you think made those rules, men or women? I think so too. I haven't heard the National Organization of Women, though, complain about any of this. Even today, rape of non-Muslim women is part of Islamic doctrine. That is really true. Rape by Muslims is so prevalent in Sweden, which is very heavily Muslim now, so prevalent in Sweden, that Sweden has forbidden the police from collecting any data in rape investigations that would point back to Islam. Simply forbidden as part of police investigation procedure. How am I doing? Got 5 minutes?
Yeah, 7 minutes, Judd.
Wow. I've only got an hour to go here. I'll just take my scissors and cut off the last few pages. Muhammad claimed to respect the scriptures, but his commands are in direct contrast to any values understood by Jews and Christians. 1 Peter 3:7, for example of many, if I look through the Old and the New Testament, I find a lot. It tells men to treat women and wives with great respect as they are equal under the Lord. There's a statement talking about unjust codes. I like this from Martin Luther King. He was sitting in the Birmingham jail in 1963, and one of the things he wrote is any law that degrades human personality is unjust. I believe that to be absolutely true. I do have a couple of things here I'd like to read. This is from the Old Testament. In Hebrew, this man lived long before that rapist and killer prophet. This is another prophet. His name is pronounced Yeshayahu in Hebrew. We pronounce it Isaiah. As recorded in Isaiah 4:10, he wrote, or he said, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed." Such warriors as killers, as are the terrorists, the raiders, the thieves, they should take heed, because Isaiah's very next words were, "Woe to those such as robbers, and to those who prey on women. What will you do in the day of reckoning when disaster comes from afar?" The people to whom he was talking to did not repent. They did not change their ways. They continued doing what they were doing, a lot of what we see in Islam. And indeed, disaster did come from afar. I believe that in many of these nations, disaster is going to come from afar. Those words from that prophet were not made for one time in one place. They are made for all times, in all places, until the end of days. Islam's creed is known as Shahada. This is why their fear is understandable. I know a lot of people who evangelize to Muslims, not just in this country, but also overseas. They're not going to have a lot of luck trying to change a Muslim's mind in a Muslim-dominated country. Those people are fearful. Their fearful is completely understandable to me. They have a creed known as Shahada in Islam. It means to confess or to profess. Shahada is brief and explicit. It reads, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet." And that creed plainly says that Muhammad is not just a prophet. It is saying that Muhammad is God's greatest prophet. The Muslims who commit violence are following precisely what Muhammad did in the 7th century and what his most prominent Orthodox Islamic disciples have done since that time.